Binding your quilt is the final step necessary before it is ready to launder, gift, sleep under, or take for a picnic. And it's easily accomplished with either straight cut binding or bias binding. And that's what we're doing in this episode of How to Quilt. I'm Deborah Mobies from Whip Stitch, and I am really grateful to you for being here as part of the How to Quilt video series. It's a little hard to believe we're wrapping it up, actually, that we've walked through 12 different sampler blocks of patchwork. We've added sashing and borders. We've talked about free motion quilting and straight line quilting, and now we've finished up our entire project and we are ready to bind it and put the final touch on. For a lot of quilters, sitting under a quilt and stitching the binding is a really grateful moment. It is, you know, some of us really enjoy starting a project and others of us really get satisfaction from completing a project. And binding is that moment where all of the dreaming and all of the planning and all of the step-by-step systematic execution culminates in this one meditative, peaceful moment of putting the binding on your quilt. There are two different types of binding that you might choose from. One is called cross-cut or straight binding, and the other is bias cut binding. And I'm going to demonstrate both for you so that you can see the difference. The edges of the quilt aren't finished, and they need to be. All the quilting is done. We're going to trim off all these little threads. Our quilt body is ready. And even if you send the quilting out to a long arm quilter, they're going to send it back to you to put the binding on. So it really is a skill you need to master in order to be a quilter. There are two types of binding you can do. You can do cross-cut binding or you can do bias binding. Cross-cut binding is just what it sounds like. From selvage to selvage on a piece of fabric, we cut a 2.5 inch wide strip. We stitch them short end to short end to make the length that we need to go all the way around the entire perimeter of our quilt and then 2 more hands width. So all the way around the quilt plus 7 to 10 inches. We cut those across strip across the width of a fabric and then apply that to the quilt. This works great. Lots of people love cross-cut binding. It's very easy. I tend to prefer bias binding, which is what this is. Bias binding, instead of being cut across, is cut on the diagonal. So the grain line is here. And that means that the binding is a little bit stretchy. What I also like about it, though, is it means that the threads are meeting at an angle along the edge. So over time in cross-cut binding, because this is a single thread here, it can wear away and the binding can pop open on the fold, exposing the insides of my quilt. Bias binding, because this is lots and lots of threads along the edge at the fold, is a lot less likely to do that. So it's my preference. Full disclosure, I am obsessed with bias tape. I love bias tape and I love making continuous bias tape. On my YouTube channel, you can find a tutorial for making continuous bias tape that has gotten almost 150,000 views because I'm not the only one who loves bias tape. It is a great option for finishing out a quilt and it will last a really long time. But whichever type of binding you choose, it has to be put on at the sewing machine first before we can anchor it in place. We're going to bind this itty bitty little quilt with this bias binding here. It was cut to 2.5 inches wide and folded in half, raw edges even. And now my raw edges are on the edge of the quilt. I'm going to line it up. I'm a righty, so I'm going to line it up on the right hand side. And starting about here, I'm going to begin stitching with my 1/4 inch presser foot. No pins at the machine. I installed my 1/4 inch presser foot and I've tried to give you guys an angle where you can really see what's happening here. Got my raw edges together. If you did free motion stitching, you'll want to re-engage your feed dogs because we will want them here. Lower my presser foot right at that 1/4 inch. I'm going to take a stitch and then I'm going to reverse because I really want to anchor this here. And then I'm going to sew all the way to the corner. If you think back to some of the blocks that we've done, I indicated that this particular presser foot has some markings on it. So there's a mark behind the needle that's a 1/4 inch back. there's a mark even with the needle, and there's a mark here that's a 1/4 inch ahead of the needle. I want to stop when that mark is even with the next edge of my quilt. And it doesn't matter how big your quilt is, it's still a 1/4 inch. I'm going to go all the way to the end, and then I'm going to back stitch. And take it off the machine. When it's off the machine, do you see how because I back stitched it's nice and anchored? I'm going to fold my binding. This is a 45-degree angle. So this edge is perpendicular to the line I just sewed, and this edge is perfectly aligned with the next side of my quilt. And if I can really yank and get a nice triangle there, I'll get my best results. I'm going to stick my fingernail at the corner and fold the bias tape to change directions. Do you see that? So here I've got this triangle, and I'm going to keep it nice and neat. So here I've got this triangle of fabric in the fold, right? There's a little flap here where the stitches stop a 1/4 inch early. The fold lines up with the first row of stitches I did, with the edge of the fabric rather, not with the stitches. And I've switched directions so that now the raw edge lines up with the next side I want to sew. Back at the needle, I'm going to start right at the edge, all the way at the edge, and then I'm going to back stitch and sew forward again. And I keep doing that until all 4 corners are stitched. So here I come. I'm going to stop early again and back stitch all the way off the machine. And then we fold away from the direction we want to go next, really pulling on those stitches to make a strong 45-degree angle, and then toward the direction I want to go next. And sort of square up this triangle so that all those edges are nice and square together, and we're really pulling on those stitches, and then we turn and we do the next side. When you do that, you're going to stitch through the tip of the triangle. That is what we're trying to do. That is the mitered corner that we're going for in our binding here. Stop early. This is corner number 4. Off the machine. All right. Away. And toward. And then again. Back to where we began. Here's where I started. And we're going to backstitch again and take it off the machine. And here's where I want to join my 2 ends. Right? I'm going to bring this guy over as if this is where it's going to be stitched, and pinch the spot where they meet and stitch a seam to connect the 2 ends of my binding. Right sides together, just 1 layer, and I mark it with my pin, the point at which when I pinch it, where that's the correct length for it to end. I mark it with a pin, and then I pull everything out of the way, but the 2 pieces of binding are opened out flat, right sides together, so that I can stitch a straight seam at the point where they meet. This is probably my least favorite step. I want this seam to be perpendicular to the fold so that when I flip it right side out again, I can check to see, did I get it the right length, so that, there we go. So that when I trim this excess, the binding has a seam in it and it's the right length. So I'm going to trim out all these seam allowances. my fingers, I'll push the seam allowances to one side and lay it flat. So now I've made my binding exactly the length of the body of my quilt and stitched a seam to hold the ends together. So I can come back to the machine and finish out that 1/4 inch seam. So here's the finished quilt with the binding on, but the binding still has to be stitched around to the other side. I'm trimming some threads off. And in some places, like here, I might trim my seam allowance too, because any extra seam allowance or batting there is going to end up inside the binding. But I don't want to trim off my corners here because they're going to flip around and reveal a nice little miter at each corner of my quilt. See that little diagonal at the corner? It's very beautiful and professional. On the reverse, I'm going to draw my binding around so that it covers up these stitches. And I use my very favorite quilt clips to anchor them. Now, it's tempting to pull it all the way around. We want the folded edge of the binding to cover the stitches, and then we clip it in place. The flat side goes to the back, all the way around the quilt. When we get to these corners, because we mitered it on the front side, it'll make a diagonal, and we want to maintain that miter on the back side. It's very pretty, clean and tidy, and it looks so professionally done. So we go all the way around the entire quilt. Again, miter that corner before folding it over so it meets at that really pretty diagonal. Clip it in place. And then we get to decide, how do we anchor this edge in place? Once the binding is attached to the body of the quilt, you get to decide. You can either finish the binding off, very last step of the entire quilt, finish the binding off by hand or by machine. We can either hand sew this down, that is definitely the most traditional method, and that is simply a hand sewing needle and thread, and you either slip stitch or whip stitch this all the way around on the interior. Or you can take it back to the machine and do what's called stitching the ditch. So attaching your binding by machine. And I think that people are kind of half and half, 50-50 divided about who does which. I'm going to demonstrate machine sewing this binding down because I think that's harder to figure out on your own. If you're going to hand sew, you get to sit under the quilt while you stitch it. It's great for while you're watching television or listening to a podcast. To machine sew, we go back to the machine with a new needle and we're going to stitch this down. This is an edge stitch foot. Some people call it a stitch the ditch foot, and it can be a nice guide for machine sewing your binding. Full disclosure, I do not usually use it. I usually use my 1/4 inch presser foot to do this, but I want to demonstrate it for you if you've never seen it before. Here's the trick with sewing on machine binding. We're sewing blind. The edge that we want to catch, we can't see from above the machine. This little gadget can keep us in the ditch so that we're nice and even and we're making invisible stitches from upstairs, but it can't promise that we'll catch this. That has to be done with your clips ahead of time. So here's technique 1, stitching in the ditch to machine, attach your binding. I'm going to keep my rudder right there. And because it's in this fold, but the needle is right behind it, if I folded my fabric well, I'll be catching the fabric as I go. Alternately, you could come in with your 1/4 inch presser foot
And I put my inside edge against the fold, which means that the needle is actually in the binding. These stitches will not be invisible or in the ditch, but they're a lot more likely to catch the binding on the back side. The other nice thing about visible binding stitches is that it makes pivoting in the corners a little easier. I can stitch all the way to that miter, lift and pivot like we've done on some of our blocks, and continue.
Congratulations. You have finished binding your quilt and you are ready to take it out into the world and introduce it to friends. There's one more episode of the How to Quilt video series left for you, where we're going to talk about what your next steps might be as a quilter. Thanks again for being here. It means a lot to me that you've been part of the How to Quilt video series.